We have a busy agenda. We have lots of things to share with you today, and I do want to get started at close to top of the hour. So I think we'll go ahead and move forward. So again, very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us here. We are the Financial Sustainability Models in Higher Education web event. I do really appreciate having you all here. If you don't know me, my name is Dr. Jennifer LeBron, and I will be your host for today. I'm going to be facilitating, but in addition to that, I'm also a technical advisor at the Education Development Center, and I'm the leader for the USAID Higher Education Learning Network, which we do call affectionately the HELEN. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event where we are going to be exploring research on funding models in different types of higher education institutions based on some forthcoming research from USAID's HEIs program. We're going to talk a lot about that in just a minute, but before we get started, I do have a few quick reminders. So first, we are recording this event, and thank you so much for being with us. In addition, also auto closed captioning is available in English. Please click the CC icon to access this feature. You can also click on the globe icon to access interpretation in French or in Spanish. Please use the chat feature to add comments whenever you'd like. We love to hear from you. And if you haven't already done so, please do introduce yourself into the chat. We'd love to know where you're calling from and your organization. We are going to be using the Q&A feature in Zoom today, which is located at the bottom or top of your screen. We're going to ask that you submit questions throughout the webinar, and you can also upvote questions that have already been submitted at any point. So please use the Q&A feature when you have questions. We will pause throughout the webinar to answer them. And finally, to preserve bandwidth, we ask that during our plenary session, you mute your microphone and turn off your camera when you are not speaking. Okay, so we have 4 big objectives for this web event. First, we want you to walk away with an understanding of what financial sustainability is and as it relates to higher education. Second, you should be able to identify some of the key contextual factors that influence higher education funding, both positively and negatively. Third, we want you to understand why it is important to diversify funding sources for higher education institutions and how diversification of funding is linked to quality of higher education institutions. And finally, to understand some key strategies for addressing barriers and increasing resilience to shocks that affect financial sustainability of higher education institutions. Okay, so this is our agenda for the today. As you can see on the screen, we have a full slate of speakers, including Dr. Magutu from the University of Nairobi, who will jump in on all things related to Kenya. We are looking forward to hearing from each of these speakers to discuss the specifics of the research as well as these different contexts. So over the last 2 years, the HELEN has grown and expanded our membership into this global network of higher education institutions, stakeholders, donors, and implementing partners. And we've brought together our members and experts to discuss many critical issues in higher education today. From our Global Evidence Summit that focused on higher education employability, private sector partnerships, and innovation, to our series focused on supporting equitable access to higher education, to our work focused on supporting higher education in crisis and conflict settings, and higher education's role in building stronger democracies. We have together explored the many ways higher education institutions and systems play a critical role in sustainable development. Financial sustainability of higher education is really foundational to strengthening higher education's institutions so that they can take on this important work. But it really is an underexplored area of research, both for the HELEN and for our larger community. So today, we're going to learn more about the mechanisms and processes that support higher education financial sustainability. To talk more about how this fits in with our learning agenda, I'm very pleased to welcome Ghazala Syed, Senior Advisor for Higher Education in the Center for Education at USAID. Ghazala, welcome. Please let us know a little bit more about how this topic fits with USAID's priorities.
Thank you, Jen. So I am the activity manager for this research, and we have, as well as for Helen, and we conducted this research under our one of our other mechanisms called SHARE, and bringing this to you through our Helen network. This is the primary research, and we are very excited about, as Jen said, it's an underexplored area to bring you the results, which our UND researchers will talk about a little bit later. I just want to highlight today that the reason we invested in this research, because this aligns closely with USAID's higher education learning agenda. As we all know, that financial sustainability enables higher education institutions to effectively plan, implement, and monitor core activities, enhance curriculum relevance, foster collaboration with the private sector, directly supporting USAID's higher education learning agenda. Sustainable financing also allows higher education institutions to invest in access and retention programs for underrepresented populations, promote learner-centered teaching, and actively participate in innovation ecosystems, ultimately enhancing educational outcomes and community impacts. And all these goals, all of these are USAID's higher education programming goals. So again, this research aligns very well with USAID's overall goals, with our higher education learning agenda and our education policy. And that is why it is very important for us to investigate how higher education institutions are moving forward towards financial sustainability to support evidence-based programming in these areas. This research has, as I mentioned earlier, has taken place in one of our other mechanisms, SHARE, which is our primary research mechanism. SHARE stands for Supporting Holistic and Actionable Research in Education, and it is implemented through country-level local partners, and it deliberately engages with the local ecosystem throughout the research process. It applies innovative and rigorous research methods while strengthening the capacity of ecosystem to generate, translate, and ultimately use evidence. So while the mechanism conduct research, it also strengthens the capacity of local higher education institutions, actors, stakeholders connected with local higher education institutions to conduct and disseminate and use research. And this is done through a process of involving key local actors in research design and implementation, ensuring that there's alignment on objectives, questions, and tools, both from USAID's end and our partner countries. So under SHARE, we are conducting multiple studies in various areas, including mother tongue, including higher education. There's 2 studies under higher education. But in this webinar today, we will be focusing on one of our higher education studies on financial sustainability. So our 2 higher education studies are called HEIs, which stands for Institutions Generating Holistic and Transformable Solutions. And so as I said, today we'll be talking about the financial sustainability study, but the other study is also very exciting. It focuses on higher education institutions' role in innovation ecosystem. Both of these studies are coming soon. So while we don't have those studies to share with you today, but please stay tuned on our EduLinks website, and you will see both studies soon. So with that, I will pass it on to Edward, the Senior Program Manager for HEIs at UND, to frame out the upcoming discussion of the results and recommendations of the study. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Ghazala. Let me start by outlining for everyone the goals and the outcomes of the larger SHARE activity. SHARE is the preliminary mechanism for the USAID Center for Education to conduct primary research in education. In order to advance USAID learning priorities in the global sector, to improve education and learning outcomes, SHARE works towards 3 intermediary outcomes. First and foremost, SHARE conducts targeted research, like the HEIs multi-country studies, to advance USAID education sector learning priorities. Second, throughout this process, SHARE works to enhance the capacity of education ecosystems to generate, translate, and use evidence to make informed program and policy decisions at all levels. Third, SHARE designs and conducts buy-in research in support of country-specific education priorities. To give some background on the HEIs studies, let me ask, what does higher education funding look like across countries? Imagine 2 institutions in the Philippines, one public and one private. The public institution receives funding from the government, which provides a baseline amount of dollars per student. In addition, the public institution receives funding from various other sources illustrated here in red. These additional funds could include fees and funds from other types of government programs. Now imagine a private institution in the Philippines. While they receive money, scholarship money, from government sources, the private institutions also have funding streams from other sources, here illustrated in green, perhaps from private funds or donors. These public and private institutions share funding, shown here in blue, but because the private institution has autonomy, it can receive funding from these additional sources on the right. These differences between higher education institutions and their funding sources and models are replicated and reimagined across countries and contexts all over the world. From more HEIs examples, take Indonesian public institutions, which are funded by numerous sources shown here. Indonesian private institutions have a mix of funding sources, some that are shared with the public institutions, and some that are entirely different. In Kenya, there is even more diversity. TVETs, or Technical and Vocational Education and Training Schools, receive direct funding in Kenya, while universities receive scholarships through other mechanisms. These differences in funding and the complexities of country contexts demonstrate the challenge of understanding higher education funding. How can an institution plan for long-term needs and make informed decisions in these complex funding landscapes? If we want higher education institutions to be central actors in development, we must understand how they are funded and how to ensure this funding is sustainable. This insight is central to the HEIs studies. To dive into HEIs specifically, I'll now pass it over to Tom Purekal, our program director on the SHARE activity.
Great. Thank you, Ed. As Ghazala already mentioned, HEIs stands for Higher Education Institutions Generating Holistic and Transformative Solutions. Today, as Ghazala noted, I will focus on the findings from our financial sustainability study. This study is made possible through the efforts of our excellent partners. First of all, we have the University of Nairobi, who led the study in Kenya. And today I'm joined by a member of the University of Nairobi who served as the principal investigator, who is Professor Obara Magutu. And it's also worth noting that the University of Nairobi is a member of the Resilient Africa Network. In Indonesia, we worked with Smart City, who is affiliated with the University of Indonesia. And in the Philippines Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, carried out the study in the Philippines. I also want to note that today's study would not be made possible without the efforts of our team at the University of Notre Dame, which was led by our principal investigator, Dr. Hyojung Jang. So the primary question that we tackled for this study was, what strategies are higher education institutions in low middle income countries implementing to promote their own financial sustainability? Also, what strategies are regarded to be the most effective contextually? As I mentioned, the study took place in Kenya, Indonesia, and the Philippines over the years 2022 to 2024. Now, stemming from this primary research question, the study went on to address 5 kind of sub-research questions, which were informed through a process of consultation with a broader ecosystem of actors, including evidence generators, translators, and users from across the 3 study countries. These different sub-questions tackled areas such as understanding the definition of financial sustainability within higher education institutions, looking at ways that they finance their operations and their various revenue streams, thinking about factors that determined or shape their financial sustainability overall, and also ways that they promote their financial sustainability, the strategies that they use, and finally thinking about the strategies that they use to manage risks and build their resilience. Now, to understand the context of each study, we'll begin by sharing a little bit about each higher education institution system for our 3 country studies. To begin, I'll invite Professor Magutu from the University of Nairobi and our principal investigator from Kenya to introduce the country context within Kenya. Professor Magutu.
Thank you, Tom. The higher education sector in Kenya, the way it is structured, we have the product categorization of the higher education institutions, where we have public and the private. And as it was said earlier, the public universities, we don't have a private TVET. The private universities find their ways of generating their revenue, and basically they are a bit flexible. The public higher education institutions are the public universities and the TVET institutions. And what they basically do, they teach market-based skills in form of diplomas. And we have seen massive growth in this education sector, the medical education sector, where in 1970s, moving to 2018, we have grown from 2 to 63 universities in the country. Further, 2018, 2019, we have seen real increase in enrollment, especially for the TVET institutions. Currently, what we are experiencing in our higher education institutions is the issue of bankruptcy, the underfunding, and the insolvency that has seen closure of campuses. And what we are looking at here at the moment is that we, as a sector, we are looking for ways of moving out of the tuition as a form of revenue. That is our situation in Kenya, and we found the 5 research questions applying to understand our case. I'll pass it back to Tom again.
Great. Thanks very much, Professor. The next country that we'll look at is Indonesia. Indonesia is fascinating in that it's a middle-income country with the 4th largest population in the world. It's currently experiencing strong economic growth and has been since 1998 at an average GDP growth rate of about 5%. And it's a country that wants to maintain this growth. Higher education institutions will be key to realizing this. Some of the areas that we'll consider the in terms of how to define these higher education institutions are factors like their status, their supervisory authority, and their different type. By status, we refer to whether they're public or private institutions. Supervisory authority, we think about the ministries that they may report to. For example, a higher education institution that focuses more on agriculture might report to the Ministry of Agriculture as opposed to the Ministry of Education. And the type of institution could range from being a university to an institute or a polytechnic or a school of higher learning academy or a community academy. Public higher education institutions are further classified based on their autonomy, level of financial dependency, and their overall operational flexibility. There is a heavy encouragement by the government for higher education institutions to be self-sufficient, as promoting revenue diversification, to partner with communities, and to commercialize their research. It's also worth noting that within Indonesia, the constitution mandates that 20% of the national budget go to education, but only 1.18% actually goes to higher education. As a result, higher education institutions are heavily reliant on tuition and foundation subsidies, which proved to be somewhat damaging during the COVID years. Our third country is the Philippines. Here we see the most distinct divide between private and public universities. Especially, it's worth noting their status and quality, which are major drivers of public perception of these institutions. Wealthy families usually send their children to private universities, but more and more we're also seeing families turn to large loans to afford private education within the Philippines. Private higher education institutions are largely autonomous and deregulated. There's also a policy of reimbursement for public universities, which may end up being kind of a large factor that's driving more enrollment into these public institutions, where we're seeing these public universities largely aided by government funding and specifically directed to the public institutions, rather than more of like that student-centered model that we might see in Kenya. We are seeing a slow change in enrollment within the Philippines, but where we are seeing a change is in where students are going. So for example, in the academic year 2009 to 2019, 61% of students attended private higher education institutions. This has dropped since when we look at the numbers in 2019, 2020, where only 54% of students attended private higher education institutions. So it dropped from 61% to 54% over that 10-year period. Public higher education institutions are largely reliant on government support, whereas private higher education institutions do rely mostly on tuition. Now we'll spend just a couple of minutes speaking about the methodology that we used for this study. It was largely in the planning and the design of the study, we divided it up into 3 phases. In the first phase, we carried out some basic desk reviews, key informant interviews, and surveys to understand the context within each country. During the second phase, we carried out a workshop that brought together actors across the ecosystem within each country to inform the research questions and the overall study design. There's also been more continuous engagement of these ecosystem actors throughout the research process. And then in the third phase of the design, we further tailored the study of the country contexts with the assistance of these advisory groups made up of the ecosystem actors, who then went on to aid and assist in data collection, analysis, and eventually validation workshops. The qualitative component of the research consisted of a combination of focus group discussions, as well as over 100 key informant interviews across the 3 countries. The quantitative component consisted of financial surveys that requested data from different higher education institutions. However, it's worth noting that there was a low response rate to these surveys, given the perception that this data could be proprietary in some cases. Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jennifer LeBron, to lead us through an exercise before we go into the findings.
Yes, thank you, Tom. I've already learned so much. I don't know about our audience, but the comparison of the countries, the way that you've designed this research study is super fascinating. I can't wait to learn more. But I think it's good that we pause and take a moment and hear from our audience. So you're going to see on your screen now a QR code, and there's going to be a link in the chat to something called Slido. So we're going to use that to get your response to this question. So click the link in the chat or use your phone to scan the QR code and take a moment to answer this question. In your experience, how do actors define financial sustainability in higher education? So take a moment and think about that question. How do actors define financial sustainability in higher education? I'm really curious. We have folks from all over the world in this webinar. So in your experience, how do your colleagues, how have you heard it defined? And take a moment to answer. And I'm sure some answers are going to pop up in the screen very quickly. I'm seeing some folks join, so that's great. People are typing. We're going to make you work in our web events. So you're going to have to answer some questions. All right. Again, I'll give folks just a few more seconds to respond, but please do write your answer in the Slido, click the link in the chat, or you can use your phone and scan the code that you see on the screen. And I'm seeing some responses come in already, which is fantastic. That's great. So we're seeing, let's see, we have having a plan or model to cover institutions' costs during ongoing basis. Yes. So just that baseline budget revenue, like being able to manage your expenses. That's how I feel about my own sustainability financially. So I get that. Somebody's being really specific here, putting government funding, tuition fees, so the actual mechanisms, the actual funding that comes through is really important. And then, yes, where revenue exceeds expenditures, I have a feeling that that anonymous might be an accountant of some kind in a former life, maybe. Yes, more folks are answering, financial sustainability can mean a lot of different things, right? I'm going to wait for other folks to answer. Covering operating costs, securing revenue. Yeah, so sustainability, I think there's some consensus around here that sustainability, financial sustainability, is focused on being able to maintain expenses, right? To be able to cover expenditures. Oh, I like this one, diverse sources of revenue, right? So pursuing a balanced and efficient budget management. Oh, and using resources efficiently. I feel like somebody may have seen some of our findings already. That sounds really familiar. Oh, no need for international donor funding. Very interesting. So self-sustaining is a way to define that. Ability to operate, reduce dependencies on annual budget fluctuations. Fantastic. You can feel free to keep on writing your responses in here, but I'm seeing a couple of consensus moments, right? The ability to have enough revenue to cover expenses, to diversify funding, to use resources efficiently, and to be able to operate, right? Just to be able to sustain your work and self-sustain your work as a higher education institution. Really great. But we're seeing some diverse responses. There's lots of different ways that our audience is thinking about financial sustainability. And I think that we're going to learn a little bit more about how this can vary by context and by who is making the definition. So to help us understand how the HEIs study began to uncover the answer to this question, let's bring back Dr. Magutu, who can share how an ecosystem workshop in Kenya, which included vice chancellors from 12 different colleges and universities, helped tackle really this first big point of contention, which is how do you define financial sustainability? So Dr. Magutu, please, how did you work to answer this question in Kenya?
Now, basically, the higher education system in Kenya, I should say, we invited indeed in the phase 2, the vice chancellors for what we call university education in Kenya. We further invited the leadership in the TVET institutions because it's a direct link for them. We also put the stakeholders on board, and we were trying, first of all, to create that common understanding that what is this we are calling financial sustainability, because the other four questions will only be understood if the issue of financial sustainability is clear to this, let me say, the higher education leadership that was going to participate in the study. And in that case, from our systems thinking workshop, indeed, we raised it. And I could say that the participants could not arrive at a common definition of what they call financial sustainability, especially in Kenya, where majority of the universities and TVET institutions are public. And they were asking themselves, why should they talk about financial sustainability, yet they are not out to make profits? They are offering a public good, which is education, and looking through it is like, what is this financial sustainability monist that we are being asked to define? And through some engagement with them, and knowing that the systems thinking workshop was supposed to do the co-creation and co-design, as we as state surgeons working with the respondents whom we were going to engage in the key informants interviews, at least we got at some point where they could understand that higher education institutions need to be financially sustainable. And from there, as we were going to collect the data from them, engaging them, we had prepared them in advance so that they will give us the information we really wanted. And I want to leave it at this point because in the next level, we are going to present a case from Kenya, especially for the TVET institutions, on how now they had to look at the issue of financial sustainability with this information. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Magutu. That was really so informative to see the process about this, co-creation workshop and setting the stage to really move the whole research project forward when everyone got on the same page. That's really helpful. Thank you. So let's move on and let's actually hear some of the big key takeaways from this overall research project, as well as a little bit more about this definitional question. And for that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom to walk us through the HEIs findings.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you, Professor Magutu. Now, let's turn to our findings. The first finding that we'll focus on is, as Professor Magutu noted, there is a need to unify around a common understanding of what financial sustainability means for a specific context. The second finding is the need for diversified funding. All countries identified this as being paramount. And then the third finding is the need to strategically reduce barriers to financial sustainability while increasing resilience to potential shocks that could inhibit these institutions. So now we'll focus on the first finding, which is to unify around a common understanding of financial sustainability. So what we'll see here, and we picked up from the study, is that the definition of financial sustainability for higher education institutions must meet and really try to fill these different criteria here. So to meet current financial and operational obligations, maintain a diversified revenue streams, be independent from government funding, manage finances autonomously, and invest in infrastructure and faculty for quality education. We'll see that the different options and opportunities for public and private institutions includes areas such as government appropriations, tuitions and fees, and other private funding sources for public institutions. For private institutions, it's largely tuitions and fees, some government funding as well. But in cases like Indonesia, we'll also see additional funding come from private entities and foundations that help found these higher education institutions. Some of the factors or determinants that can define financial sustainability within higher education institutions cross both national level, as well as the higher education institutions themselves. So at the national level, we might think about higher education policies and regulations or different demographic and macroeconomic trends. Within higher education institutions, we'll look at areas such as competent and effective leadership, the reputation of these institutions based on the quality education that they provide, their autonomy in financial decision-making, the infrastructure that they have for both teaching and financial management, as well as their own mechanisms for financial planning and management with transparency and integrity. So going further into this, we note that there is a combination of factors, both, as I mentioned, across higher education institutions, as well as within the broader environment of macroeconomic trends. So within higher education institutions, we found that it's really important to consider aspects such as governance of these higher education institutions, leadership, as well as pricing and their ability to manage costs overall. At the macroeconomic kind of level, we'll see government policies and regulations that comprise major external factors, and noting how certain policies can affect the system at large and shift the demand even between public and private higher education institutions, requiring these institutions to adapt quickly to the extent possible to these changing policies and regulations. We'll also see an importance on accountability overall, which speaks to the level of autonomy that higher education institutions may enjoy as determined by the government, and which can affect their ability to engage in income-generating activities or adapt to respond to policy changes. And a third and final factor is really very important: quality, right? An overriding factor that speaks to the ability to prepare the workforce, and perhaps even more so, the perception of their ability to do so. This can have a major influence on the demand for services from higher education institutions. Now, within higher education institutions, we see that these factors, we'll explore these and pack these a little bit more. Looking at the leadership and governance structures, for example. This speaks to the importance of having the right people in the right positions. This emerged as a finding across all three countries. Visionaries and strong administrators can have a transformative effect on these institutions. Individuals who can navigate financial challenges, implement strategic initiatives, and maintain institutional reputation are fundamental and important to kind of remember and recognize, as some of the countries that we looked at may actually have bring in leaders based on political preferences, and so identifying ways to kind of maybe counter that. We also look at national policies and regulations. These can either hamper or unleash the potential of higher education institutions. For example, the government of Kenya's directive for TVETs that Professor Magutu will go over, and the call for them to focus on STEM education can result in the need to change the infrastructure and bring in new faculty and resources into these TVETs. But it can also have a countering effect on those current institutions that do focus on STEM and displace them and the resources that they have as students then move to TVET institutions, right? We'll also consider macroeconomic structures are really important, and the impact of macroeconomic factors, and particularly inflation and market demands. This is a shared challenge, and as was with all three countries, converging on the need for higher education institutions to adapt to these changing conditions and student preferences. However, these factors emerged more prominently in the Philippines, within their higher education landscape, where we saw the challenge of providing quality education at an affordable cost, particularly as wages and salaries rise to match inflation. In the private and public higher education institution examples, we saw the salaries and wages constitute the largest portion of total expenditures, ranging from somewhere between 40 to 59%. But in the private higher education institutions, this increased to 86 to 93%, as in, I'm sorry, that was in the state universities and colleges, and it was in the private and higher education institutions where it ranged from 40 to 59%. And then the final factor is the quality of education and the student demand and preferences. Higher education institutions in all three countries are encouraged to innovate and adapt to shifts in student preferences, such as the growing demand for online learning, and a demand for short courses or micro-credentials. But it's also important to note that there is also a restrictive regulatory environment in certain cases that can limit the ability of higher education institutions to respond to market demands effectively and in a timely manner. We also want to note three barriers to financial sustainability in particular that we've alluded to already, but I want to highlight these a little bit more. Number one, poor cohesion around desired outcomes for the country and the expectations of higher education institutions to contribute toward these goals. Number two is a shifting demand within the marketplace that drives government responses and leaves higher education institutions needing to continuously adapt. And number three, regulations that often hamper the quality of higher education institutions, which can inhibit opportunities to otherwise capitalize on revenue sources. After looking at all of these study findings, we've come up with recommendations for the government and for development partners. So among the recommendations for government, the first is to develop and think about a comprehensive plan for the higher education subsector. And this should be aligned with the economic goals of the country, the needs of the workplace and the workforce overall. And then secondly to that is to develop a comprehensive financing model that's tailored for each country context and considers the plan and the role of higher education institutions overall within this broad range world of economic development. And for these financing models to consider the needs of students and higher education institutions as aligned with these national goals. And then recommendations for development partners are specifically really to partner with higher education institutions in collaborative research and other projects, such as alternative income generating activities, and creating and deepening these partnerships, while strengthening the capacity of these higher education institutions and their faculty. Now I'll pass it to Jen to help facilitate some questions from your side.
So much, Tom. Yes, questions are coming in, but I have to admit some of them are trying to get ahead of us. So I do encourage you, if you have a question about this first key takeaway around the definitions and understanding what financial sustainability involves, please do use the Q&A function in Zoom in order to put your question into the chat. But I think I'd like to get started and sort of kick us off with perhaps more of a process question to understand the ways in which these initial workshops and engagement help set the stage for all of these different actors to come to a common definition of financial sustainability. Can you talk a little bit about that process and why it was useful to get to these guiding frameworks and the findings that you have here?
Yeah, sure. I think the the big part that we realized was the need and the way that SHARE approaches its research, and that USAID is also now approaching research these days, is to make sure that we're creating studies and research that's relevant to the broader community of practitioners and policymakers. So really recognizing the need to involve them throughout the research process overall. And so it was important during these workshops to make sure that we convene these different actors to identify where some of the really big sticking points were when it came to financial sustainability. And as Professor Magutu referenced in Kenya, for example, that's where this question of even needing to define what financial sustainability really emerged that as a major question and a point of needing to identify some kind of consensus. So we've identified and realized that the importance of involving these actors, as well as making sure that they're involved not just in the design, but throughout the research process, so that ultimately the findings that we have can be relevant and usable.
Professor Magutu, please. Anything else you want to add?
Thank you. If I may add something, like the systems thinking workshop gave an opportunity to us as the research team to get what the government will expect from the study. As in, we were told what has been done so far, the ground that has been covered, so that we don't reinvent the wheel. At the same time, it gave us an opportunity to get the right props that we are going to use in our key informants interviews, so that we don't lose certain aspects. Reason again, the ones who came to the workshop were representing the majority out there. So we will not say that we were to run, we were to get something from the bigger sample or from the bigger population that was going to be presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Magutu. Maybe just one more quick question, Tom, if you don't mind. I'm curious, you put up these key barriers to financial sustainability, and one of them, the top one, was around poor cohesion around the desired outcomes for the country with regards to this. Do you have any good practices or things you might want to highlight about ways to bring these groups together, higher education institutions, governments, et cetera, to have a key good outcome, to have a sense of cohesion around their goals? Things that you could share.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes much more really in these strategic planning stages as countries think about the needs of the workforce, set their economic targets, set their growth targets, and recognizing what do they their most valuable asset are their people and their population and how much that's valued, but that their ability to contribute to some of these goals will hinge on their education and the skills that they have. And so seeing how much higher education institutions and really valuing the role that these institutions play in preparing that workforce is critical. It's key, right? So how much of voice or space at the table do representatives from higher education institutions have when some of these goals and targets are being set, and especially when growth strategies are being put into place, right? So making sure that higher education institutions, I think, are involved in that process of strategy definition and development is, I think, maybe kind of one way to think about this.
Fantastic. Thank you. You're speaking my language. The role of higher education in society is super important. That's one of my favorite topics. So thank you for that. I know that we're going to have more time for Q&A. There are some questions in the Q&A that I promise I will get to, but please feel free to add more questions as we move forward. And before we go on to the next key takeaway, and just like we did earlier, I want to hear from you first. So you're going to see another QR code on the screen and a link in the chat. So please feel free to respond using the link in the chat or scanning the QR code again. This question is a little bit of a quiz. So what percentage of the national budget for education in your country goes to higher education? So please feel free to type the country if you'd like to, the country context, as well as the percentage that you think. So, and again, this is the percentage of the national budget for education as a whole. What percentage of that goes specifically to higher education in your country? Take your best guesses. There's no wrong answers here. Really curious about what you are bringing knowledge-wise to this question. So, what percentage of the national budget for education in your country goes to higher education? There will be a couple of answers coming. I'll give you all a couple more seconds to answer this question. And this isn't a question about how much you want it to go to higher education, because I personally would like a lot of it to go to higher education, because that's my jam. But for you all, what percentage of the national budget for education in your country goes to higher education? What do we think? Oh, I see less than 2%. With a sad face, I agree. Any other guesses? 5% of the budget. Somebody from the US is saying maybe 6%, question mark. Somehow that feels a little optimistic, but I don't know. Private investment in public university fees easily equal or surpass that. So it's a very good point about the diversification of funding, which is our next key takeaway. I know that other people are thinking hard about this, but I do have to move on. So thank you so much for participating in our quick little poll. And let's get some answers to this. So why don't I turn it back over to Tom, who's going to talk about diversification of higher education funding.
Great. Thanks very much, Jen. This is a big question for many governments. How much should they be investing in higher education institutions? I think as we were looking at this, it's important to note that very few countries have this figured out, whether they're rich or poor. Very few have put in place a strategy for sustainable financing of higher education institutions that actually works. One example is the United States, for example, right? So where we look at public and private funding that's used to contribute to higher education institutions, but it's really funded through a large level of debt, both at the national level, as well as what we're seeing students and families taking out. So which one might make the argument that this is really not sustainable. Across the 3 study countries, we are seeing this convergence to approximately 0.6% of gross domestic product on tertiary education expenditures versus what we're seeing in some of these OECD, more wealthy countries that tend to spend closer to 1.1% of GDP. But very few low middle income countries are actually spending at this 1.1% rate. And it's actually also worth noting that even some of these OECD countries are projecting spending less than 1.1% in this post-COVID era. Now I'll pass it to Professor Magutu to provide some information on the TVET example that we've referenced already. So, Professor.
Thank you, Tom. The question that has just been asked about how much is allocated to the higher education institutions in our country, I chose not to participate because this is what I was talking to. For us in Kenya, the Ministry of Education is the one that gets the bigger budget of what they are going to spend. And they are supposed to spend in, let me say, 3 subsectors of that ministry. One is the basic education, which gets 80% of whichever money that is given to the Ministry of Education. And that is where majority of our people are, as in training basic education. Then there is university education, which is given 16%. Then TVET institutions are given 4%. Now, what we are seeing here, okay, of course, our focus was on the universities and the TVET institutions. What you are seeing here, the Kenyan example is the one you are seeing at the top, and this is what I want to speak into. Our situation in Kenya as the best example is the one that receives the least amount of money in terms of budget is the one that is excelling, which is showing us that the revenues are usually above the expenditures. And that is an element pointing towards sustainability. In that situation, again, what we are seeing for TVET institutions, we have 10 national polytechnics and several technical training institutes. These, they employ their council staff and the number has been increasing. Interesting again about the admissions, they are receiving 4% of the budget, but when you look at the enrollment, for example, if I can give you in the last 2 years, 2024, where we are at the moment, the TVET institutions admitted 188,775 students, while universities were admitting less, one for the 1,392. 2023, TVETs were admitting 131,000 students, while universities in total, all universities, public and private, were admitting 124. A very big disparity, but yet these TVET institutions still have revenue which is above the expenditures. Now, trying to explain what happens there, they have to pay their, let me call them council, they employ their own staff. The number has been on the increase and the government has not been employing let me say, the tutors that are supposed to be paid by the Public Service Commission. Then looking at another issue there, the courses that are being taught by these TVET institutions have a very big market. They are marketable. That is to say, compared to the graduates from the 2 technical universities we have in the country, because those are the ones that are offering some element of diplomas and related courses that these TVET institutions are offering. And for them, I think they have an element of income generating activities because the funding mix that they are using is not that of relying in the government. Then the other thing is that the government on the issue of policy, as Tom was putting it, is like the government wants people with more technical skills and the employers will prefer to take the graduates from the TVET institutions, which is an element of marketing confidence in these institutions, attracting the higher numbers. At the same time, they are receiving several grants which are directed to this sector because they know they are marginalized with the 10%, the 4% allocation. If I can give like some certain years there, they were relying on like 18 billion, which is just a very small percentage. Sometimes they were getting 2.7% of the budget allocation. That was in 2019, 2020. This has not normalized, but on average, that is where it is. So this is one of the examples. People have talked about 20%, 5% in their countries, but this is one of the set of institutions that look like they are underfunded, but the graph you are seeing up there, their revenues are above the expenditures. Thank you, and back to you, Tom.
Great. Thanks very much, Professor. That's really exciting. Now we'll kind of focus on different strategies across the countries, which fall largely into 4 camps. The first is alternate income generating activities, right? So all the countries agree that this is an important strategy for diversifying revenue. And includes examples such as agriculture and processing of agricultural products, or trades and services, or production and manufacturing, or even short courses. However, there has been a lack of accountability and transparency in financial reporting at times. This has been a challenge in Kenya, often hampered at times by government procurement requirements. In the Philippines, we saw higher education institutions engage in various alternative income generating activities, including agriculture and non-agricultural projects, hotels, and solar parks, as described by some of the people that we spoke with from these public higher education institutions in the Philippines. Another strategy camp that's important to think about are partnerships and collaborations with national, and thinking about these collaborations with national and local governments, the private sector, development partners, and other higher education institutions. In all three of the countries, we saw collaborations with local industries and international organizations, which have allowed higher education institutions to reduce their costs and strengthen their educational programs by enhancing curricula and infrastructure and improving the research capabilities of faculty. A third camp of strategies is to efficiently use resources. In Indonesia, for example, we saw public higher education institutions capitalize on their physical assets, including healthcare facilities and equipment, while private higher education institutions focused on leveraging human capital and engaging in research collaborations to help generate revenue. And a fourth camp for these strategies is market expansion. And really looking at ways that higher education institutions can pursue research grants or engage in consultancies or commercialize their research as a key strategy for promoting financial sustainability. In the Philippines, we saw examples of public higher education institution administrators acknowledging that research innovations and services can be a significant source of income, but that they require resources that only a few higher education institutions really have, right? So this is largely, I think this strategy, this camp of strategies is largely underutilized in Indonesia and Kenya, which may then identify an opportunity for growth and untapped areas right now. So, and also consider the quality of education and job placement that will also enable alumni to donate back to universities. And it's worth noting right now that not many of the countries, the countries that we looked at, not many institutions are really leveraging the strength of endowments, private donations, or really even industry partnerships to the extent possible. So recommendations coming from this set of this findings for the government is that they provide increased government allocations to public higher education institutions in a timely manner. And the timeliness is important so that these institutions can rely on when these resources are coming in and allow them to focus then on other resources that would complement the government funding. Also, to simplify and streamline procurement regulations for higher education institutions that will allow them to more efficiently increase the quality and to better facilitate income generating activities, and also to provide tax exemptions for donations and endowments for these higher education institutions. For higher education institutions, the big recommendation is to strengthen research commercialization and incentivize alternative income generating activities. And here we'll see that some of the government recommendations can really help facilitate this even more. Now I'll pass it to Jen again for another round of questions.
I'm coming in with questions, yes. So thank you so much, Tom. I actually have a couple of questions. This was a very big topic. People really wanted to know about how to diversify funding streams. And I have a couple of questions on this. I think very clearly summarized some of the innovative financial sustainability strategies. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how these additional sources of revenue vary between public and private institutions, as well as systems that are more market-oriented, where students have some control about where they go, versus systems of higher education that might be more government-controlled. Can you talk a little bit more about where you see those strategies being most effective, most innovative, most used?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as I noted maybe before a little bit, the what we saw in Indonesia was really helpful in the way that they were leveraging some of their existing infrastructure, seeing that as an asset, right? And especially using that to help some of these private institutions, whether they be hospitals or medical centers, engage in research, or even to use these facilities for their own research or their own kinds of services that might be needed. I think there's opportunities to do this in many different countries. One of the bigger constraints that I kind of referenced, and I think this was true in particularly in Kenya, are some of these procurement regulations that the governments may put in place, where they're required to use pre-approved government vendors as they consider income generating activities. And to an extent, it's a good strategy in the sense that want to make sure that the vendors that they're using are high quality vendors, but also kind of thinking about aspects of price and cost. And so just making sure that higher education institutions have the opportunity to use other vendors who are qualified and who can ensure quality, but may cost less than some of these pre-approved government vendors, right? So
So thanks so much. And thanks to Jorge Delgado for a couple of those questions. I have one more question, and this is really about coming both from David as well as a couple of anonymous members. This question about sort of sponsorship and international collaboration. Can you talk a little bit more about the sort of strategies that institutions use to sort of facilitate internationalization, or the kinds of strategies they use in order to create these connections abroad that could lead to innovative sources of funding?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are opportunities certainly with private sector institutions from abroad, to especially as they want to engage in research, commercialization of different research products coming out. In Indonesia, it was noted that it can be quite cumbersome to release patents and patent process, for example. That could be of benefit to international collaborators. But I think what the government was trying to do with around patents is to make sure that the patents are, or the innovations that are coming out, are usable for a broader range of the population and not just for a specific target or specific demographic. And so wanting to make sure that there's a quality in the innovation that's coming out as they are releasing patents, but also making sure that if there are ways to just to ease up the patents, I think that can help out maybe some of these international collaborators that are coming in. Also, just noting the quality of higher education institutions overseas, especially kind of regional institutions, can help, and the opportunities to collaborate more across these different institutions can really help drive the quality and opportunities for innovation within the higher education institutions of a specific country.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate that answer, because it really demonstrates sort of these systems level approaches we need in order to facilitate this financial sustainability. So thanks for pointing this out. All right, folks, it's your last chance. We have one more question for you to talk about our final key takeaway, which is about reducing barriers and increasing resilience to shocks. And so you're going to see a QR code on the screen and a link in the chat to answer this question, which is, what are barriers to financial sustainability in higher education in your context? So lay it on us. What are the barriers that you're seeing to prevent financial sustainability? I'll give you a couple of minutes to type in the QR code or the link to our Slido to answer this question. Based on the questions that have come in the Q&A, I know you all have some barriers that you want to share. So please take a moment and fill in this question. And again, one more time, what are the barriers to financial sustainability in higher education in your context? I'm not going to be surprised if I see, oh, there we go, the cost of running higher education institutions. Absolutely. The increased cost associated with faculty salaries, with infrastructure needs, et cetera. The variability of public funding, absolutely. Budget cuts, market shocks, et cetera. Oh, the eroding belief in the mission and purpose of higher education. Absolutely. The contested nature of the purpose of higher education, who it serves, and what its purpose is in society can create competing demands that can erode financial sustainability. Absolutely. I think a few more people are typing. I'm going to give it another few seconds to see if we get any others. Conflict, absolutely. This is such a huge issue in, unfortunately, too many parts of our world. And then this question about, again, the purpose of higher education, aligning higher education with labor market needs and the economy. Absolutely. The Helen does a lot of work on employability. We talk a lot about that as well, doing some research on that. Centralized control of the government, right? And also centralized control that inhibits, right, these kinds of financial sustainability strategies that Tom was talking about. And the balance between leaving no one behind and the availability of resources. Absolutely. The expansion of access of higher education creates less resources for each individual student that's now enrolling in higher education. And so how do we balance the expansion versus the cost associated with that? Love these answers. Thanks so much for this. So let's learn a little bit more about how we can understand how to reduce barriers and increase the resiliency of higher education. So I'm going to, once again, pass it back to Tom to learn more.
Great. Thanks, Jen. So let's go into the barriers then. I think the first thing I think that we're seeing is that there's no one size fits all strategy, as much as some of us might like to see this, right? So each country needs to consider its assets and its different constraints in the contexts, right? Also, there are many current internal and external policies that currently inhibit higher education institutions from realizing their full potential. And then a third barrier is the consistent investment that higher education institutions require in order to maintain their levels of quality and relevance, and ensuring that they have the infrastructure, research institutions, and facilities that are needed in order to promote innovation and address the needs of the marketplace, right? But with these barriers also come different opportunities. The first opportunity is the opportunity to leverage the dynamics of a specific region and determine the correct mix of higher education institutions. As Professor Magutu mentioned, even kind of in Kenya, their ability to adapt and focus on TVETs. And we're seeing TVETs filling the need for the marketplace and in a way that actually is sustainable and where their revenues exceed their expenses, right? So thinking about the number of vocational institutions versus colleges and what is that right mix that considers the different assets of a country, right? Another opportunity is to reduce the administrative burdens and increase transparency and consider how policies can best contribute to workforce development and economic growth as a whole. And a third opportunity is to afford greater autonomy of public and private institutions and investment, and to see how that investment can improve the quality of education and improve tuition contributions from student enrollment, and then ideally then, if it's meeting the needs of the workplace, then seeing how alumni contributions or other private donations can continuously kind of roll in to help support these higher needs for investment and ongoing investment. Great. So one of the points we mentioned is this need to mitigate risks. This came up in all three countries. And one of the major strategies that came up around this was to recognize the need to generate financial reserves and using these as a vital risk mitigation strategy, especially relevant when we saw the experiences of higher education institutions during COVID. These financial reserves would center on themes of helping them to adapt and build resilience overall. Also, this should be coupled with effective financial management, which we saw emphasized in Kenya and in Indonesia. And looking at the Philippines examples, where they focused on additional risk mitigation plans to further bolster the financial reserves and complementing the existing financial management practices that they had in place. But then across the three countries, we did note some very appropriate and relevant national strategies on reducing risk and resilience. Reducing risk, but increasing resilience, right? So the first is to adopt innovative technologies and digital learning approaches, which can actually even help expand access of education services to populations who may not currently be able to take advantage of them. Also to form risk management committees and conduct external and internal audits, right? So then to map and identify existing risks and that plan for unexpected shocks, to continue capacity strengthening of leadership and staff. We identified this as a major area, an opportunity for building resilience, and especially in these areas of risk management protocols and technology. In Indonesia, we saw this example of being able to have more adaptable budget management and especially to kind of think about budgets and efficiently managing them for the next 5, 10, 20 years, right? So to automate financial processes, making them more efficient overall. And in the Kenya and Philippines, we saw this example of strengthening financial reserves for shocks, which we already spoke to as well. So recommendations around this third finding are first for governments to invest in digital infrastructure within public higher education institutions, right? We kind of think about this as a way to increase access, and especially during times when students may not be able to participate in person, making sure that there are more virtual options, for example, for student participation and engagement. For higher education institutions, developing these comprehensive risk mitigation plans, considering their assets, thinking about potential risks that they're highly vulnerable to, and what are the risks and what are the opportunities to help build resilience against those potential risks. And so doing some thinking into what those plans might look like. And then finally, for recommendations for development partners, is to partner with higher education institutions and governments in these digitization efforts and to provide funding that targets schools and specifically their lack of digital infrastructure. So to close, if you'd like to access this final study report, which will be available at the end of next month, and other findings and studies reports from SHARE overall, please feel free to email us, or you can just scan this URL code.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. Such a rich, amazing work that you've done. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we actually just have one last question in the chat that I think maybe might be helpful to sort of drive the point home. The question is regarding cost structures. What have you found out about making higher education institutions less expensive to run? And I think you talked a little bit about this when you were talking about reducing risk, but maybe you could provide a finer point to address that specific question.
Yeah, less expensive to run. I mean, So what we saw, some countries have a higher percentage of administrative staff and than other institutions, right? So within the country or other countries, right? So thinking about what that mix is between the faculty that you bring on and the number of administrators that you bring on, right? So and a lot of that can be driven by decisions made by leadership, and which is, I keep coming back to this point about leadership and the importance of investing in good leaders for these institutions, as opposed to maybe just kind of government appointees or kind of people who are receiving political favors, right? So who you bring in that leadership can really make or break these institutions and the way that they manage their finances. Also having good, efficient systems in place, financial management systems, having and carrying out these internal and external audits to promote transparency and accountability, helping people appreciate the way that resources are used and have confidence that they're used more efficiently, as efficiently as possible, can also help stimulate additional kind of funding from either private benefactors or foundations as well, right? So
That's great. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We have a lot of implementing partners, I think, in the audience, and thinking about financial sustainability isn't just about necessarily finding the next thing that you can commercialize or the next research partnership that you can fund. It's really about making sure that you have the capacity within the institution at the leadership level, at the management level, in order to support good financial management, good financial sustainability, and then also to do all of these other ways to diversify funding, ways to really conceptualize and plan for financial sustainability. So that's really great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, but of course, if you have any, feel free to drop them along. I do want to do a couple of closing items before we finish up. And I think the first thing I really want to do is sort of summarize the conversation. We've talked a lot. We've talked about 90 minutes so far about financial sustainability. And I think there are 3 key things that you should take away from this research. One, that you need to define financial sustainability in order to have a common vision and bring stakeholders along to have a firm plan on financial sustainability. That's government, institutions, administrators, etc. 2, we talked a lot about how we need to diversify funding and that we need to be able to increase the capacity of higher education institutions in order to be able to collaborate with others, to have good financial administrative processes and procedures, in order to be able to capitalize on new diverse funding streams. And 3, we need to mitigate risk. It's an important one as we think about higher education institutions facing shocks from climate change, from artificial intelligence, from other stressors that could impact higher education in the future. And so how can we think about financial sustainability, not just about diversifying revenue streams, but mitigating risk and creating more financial stewardship over the resources that exist? So those are your big 3 key takeaways. I do want to encourage you, if you'd like to learn more about financial sustainability in higher education, I really encourage you to read the HEIs multi-country study when it is published in the next few weeks. There's also going to have country level studies that will be published on financial sustainability as well. So there's much more research to be had. And to learn more about the SHARE mechanism and all of the wonderful research they've done, Tom's mentioned it before, but you can feel free to go to their website, which is linked in the chat, so that you can learn more about all of the great work that they have done. And finally, we know that many of you are already members, but if you are one of those who are attending your first Helen event, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We'd love for you to join the network officially. To do that, you can simply scan the QR code that you see on the screen, or you can click the new link that is in the chat. And if you're already a member, please take a moment. Think about somebody in your own network, a colleague, a friend who might be interested in this kind of work, who might be interested in learning more about higher education, and copy that link and send an email off and encourage them to join the network so we can have more folks who are interested in higher education join us. And with that, we have actually reached the end of our time today, but I do want to give you an opportunity. If there are any other questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to type them into the chat. Really appreciate you being here. And I really want to thank so much the Heights team, for everyone, for your sharing your wonderful research and for taking on this really important work. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to having more conversations with you across the Helen platforms on financial sustainability. And with that, I will close and we'll be around if you have any other questions. Thanks so much.